Genesis 1 is quite a chapter in that it really is a battleground. It's a battleground for unbelievers and believers alike. Unbelievers fuss about the Creator, and believers fuss about the creation, or the Bible description of it. In Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. God created a continuum of time, space, and matter. And in Genesis 1, verse 2, it appears to me that Satan has already been created, the angels have already been created, and water has already been created because it's mentioned in verse 2. And so you have a time period in there. It's kind of hard to pin down how long. I would say maybe a possible couple thousand years. And then Genesis 1:3 begins the 7-day creation story, where Exodus 20, verse 11 mentions that God made the heaven and the earth. But in Genesis 1, verse 1, God created the heaven and the earth. So it's uniquely different. So it says in John 8:44, Jesus said that Satan was a liar from the beginning. So were the angels and Satan created just prior to Genesis 1, verse 1, or just right there? It's who knows. Okay, but still, the gap idea doesn't simply hinge upon the word replenish in Genesis 1:29. That's not the only witness we have upon this idea. 2 Peter, the Bible is such a fascinating book. You go clear to the back of the Bible and God gives more and more light about his revelation. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter is giving some light about something. So we want to look at the context of it. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Okay, well, I probably should read verse 3. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Okay, so that's our context. From the beginning of the creation, Genesis 1, verse 1. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And then he says, but the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Often the assumption is that verse 5 and 6 is a record of Noah's flood. But since he says in verse 4, the beginning of the creation, I would put that at Genesis 1, verse 2 flood. Where in Genesis 9, verse 11, God implies there are two floods. One destroyed all flesh, and the other destroyed the earth. So in Genesis 1, verse 1, the earth was without form and void, but the heaven was not. Something happened to the earth. In this account, there is a new set. The heavens were of old also, and the earth. So Peter's implying there's something going on here that we just possibly need to consider. In 2 Peter chapter 2, it implies three different judgments. Okay, in 2 Peter 2, verse 4, for if God spared not the angels that sinned, and cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Okay, possibly Genesis 1, 2, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah the eighth person, okay, Genesis 6, and turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19. Now granted, the angels there in Genesis 6 also, because we learn from history that we don't learn from history, and if we don't learn from history, we're destined to repeat it. Now, Genesis 1, verse 1, or verse 2, where it says the earth was without form and void, that phrase, the earth was without form and void, is found one other time in the Bible, so it would do us good to go to that place. Jeremiah 4, verse 23. Jeremiah says, "For I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void." Okay. "And the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of heaven were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful places was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. For thus saith the Lord, the whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end." Now, when you read that context, you pretty much can figure out that that is describing the tribulation time period just prior to the second coming. But the writer is writing both of these in past tense. So in Genesis 1, verse 2, for us, that is history. In Genesis 4, that is prophecy. And that's why Jesus said in Matthew 24, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be coming in the days of the coming of the Son of Man." Both of these accounts are written in past tense. Both of these accounts reveals the after effects of the judgment of God. The earth was without form and void. Okay, now let's look up that word void, and we discover that in Nahum 2, verse 10. And here's how he writes this. "She is empty and void and waste, and the heart melteth, and the knees smite together, and much pain is in all loins, and the faces of them all gather blackness." So Nahum is describing judgment, the judgment of God, where it's become void. Okay, where in Numbers chapter 30, the practical application of Numbers chapter 30 is when a wife makes a vow and it's a wrong vow, and then her husband hears about it, he can cause something that took place become void. Numbers 12, verse 10. "But if her husband hath utterly made them void on the day he heard them, then whatsoever proceedeth out of her lips concerning her vows," and so forth, "her husband hath made them void." Okay, so we have the earth is without form and void. Okay, and then we have darkness showing up in Genesis 1, verse 2. Now, that darkness is a very interesting study in itself. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The darkness is, if we go other places throughout the Bible, we discover in Exodus chapter 10, verse 21, where God had darkness when he was executing the plagues or judgment on the nation of Egypt, and with Pharaoh and company. And remember that Pharaoh was called a devil, or a dragon in Ezekiel 29. And the Lord said unto Moses, "Stretch out thine hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt." So darkness here is a sign or evidence of the judgment of God. Exodus 20, verse 21. "And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was." We also find this in Job 22, verse 11, about the darkness. The darkness is evidence of the judgment of God throughout other places in the Bible. Job 22, verse 11, "Or darkness, that thou canst not see, and abundance of waters cover thee. Oh, here we have an example. Job is the closest book to the flood, okay, as far as the writing of the book. Eliphaz, one of the three buddies that came to Job, was the firstborn son of Esau. So this is way long before Moses. And here in Job 22:11 it says, or darkness that thou canst not see, and the abundance of waters cover thee, just like Genesis 1:2. Is not God in the height of heaven? And behold the height of the stars, how high they are? And thou sayest, how doth God know? Can he judge through the dark cloud? Yes, he can. Thick clouds are a covering to him that he seeth not. And he walketh in the circuit of heaven. That's an interesting word, the circuit of heaven. We find other places with this idea of darkness and the judgment of God. In Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 16, Jeremiah writes, give glory to the Lord your God before he cause darkness and before your feet stumble upon the dark mountains. So darkness is evidence of the judgment of God. In Joel chapter 2, verse 2, this one is about the second coming. A day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Just like we read there in Genesis 1, verse 2. In Zephaniah 1, verse 15, he writes, that day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress. Okay, so that is a description of the second coming. Okay, whereas it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of Son of Man. And we learn from history that men don't learn from history, so they're repeating this. Genesis 1:2, flood. Genesis 6, flood. Okay, and then you have Genesis 19, fire. And then you have the second coming. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. We find this also way in the back of the book. We go to the little letter by the name of Jude. And it says in Jude verse 6, and the angels which kept not their first estate, the first estate is in the spirit world, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. In verse 13 he writes, raging waves of the sea, foaming out their own shame, wandering stars to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. So in this video, just going through the idea of Genesis 1-2, looking at other passages that will provide some light on the idea. Again, the idea is here that the original creation, Genesis 1 verse 1, and then 1 verse 2, where Satan was the anointed cherub put in charge, God destroyed the earth, flooded it in Genesis 1-2, and then Genesis 1-3, through chapter 2, verse 4 will be the record of the 7-day creation story.